Sri Lanka. It's just this incredible island, right? Breathtakingly beautiful. But here's the thing. How do you protect all that natural wonder when the world is constantly developing? That's what we're digging into today. We're going to look at the legal shield Sri Lanka has built up over the years, a whole system based on its constitution, tested in the courts, and all designed to protect its future. And really, that's the big question, isn't it? I mean, for a country like Sri Lanka, where its identity, its economy, it's all so tied to its environment, finding the answer is way more than just some legal exercise. We're talking about survival. We're talking about prosperity. So let's see exactly how they've tackled this huge challenge. Okay, so here's the plan. First, we'll get our heads around what environmental law even is. Then, we'll jump into Sri Lanka's legal backstory. After that, we'll see the law in action with some big court cases, focus in on protecting that amazing coastline, and finally, we'll wrap up with a really important tool called the EIA. All right, let's dive right in. First things first, we need to lay some groundwork. Before we can really get into the specifics for Sri Lanka, we've got to ask a really basic question. What are we even talking about when we say environmental law? So you might think environmental law is just one big book of rules, but it's not like that at all. It's actually more like a really strong fabric, woven together from all these different threads. You've got pieces of civil law, human rights law, even international agreements, all of them coming together to create this protective shield. And what's at the very core of all of this? Well, it's a really simple but powerful idea that every single person has a fundamental right to live in a healthy environment. That's it. That's the bedrock, the moral and legal foundation for everything else we're about to talk about. Okay, so they have this core principle, but how do you take that idea and turn it into an actual modern legal system? Well, for Sri Lanka, it's a story that starts with these scattered colonial-era rules and evolves into the coordinated national strategy they have today. So, the journey really kicks off back in the colonial period with a bunch of different regulations here and there. But the game changer, that came in the 1970s. People were starting to pay more attention. And then in 1973, a big mission pointed out the single biggest problem. There was no central agency in charge. It was like, who's driving the bus here? That realization was the spark that led to the National Environmental Act and the creation of the Central Environmental Authority, the CEA, to finally get everyone on the same page. And this wasn't just some policy paper. This commitment got cemented into the highest law of the land, the 1978 Constitution. And look, the Constitution didn't just suggest protecting the environment, it made it a command. This quote you see here, it's not just a nice idea. It's a direct order to the government. It basically says, this is your job now. It became an official guiding principle. And what's really cool is how the Constitution does this. It's like a three-pronged attack. First, you've got fundamental rights, which act as an indirect shield. Second, the directive principles put the responsibility squarely on the government's shoulders. And then, this is the part that brings it all together. Article 28 makes it every single person's duty to protect nature. So it's not just the government's problem, it's a shared responsibility for everyone. Okay, so it's one thing to have all these great laws written down, right? But the real test is what happens when they get challenged. How do they hold up under pressure? Well, let's take a look at how these principles have actually been tested in a courtroom. Check this out. We've got two huge cases here that really put the laws to the test, and they had totally different outcomes. First, the Noimona case. Residents were being affected by quarry blasting. The court's decision? The blasting could continue, but only under newly agreed-upon terms. It was a compromise. But then you have the Epohuela case, which challenged this massive deal to mine phosphate. And in that one, the project was shut down, completely rejected. It just goes to show you the critical role the courts play. It's not just about if a right was violated, but also about the scale of the damage and whether or not there's a middle ground. All right, so from the courtroom, let's zoom in on one specific area where these laws are constantly being put to the test. Sri Lanka's absolutely magnificent and incredibly important coastline. And when I say important, I mean it. Just look at these numbers. They're staggering. A full quarter of the country's population lives right there in the coastal zone. It's the economic powerhouse, generating almost 2/3 of the fish, home to over 60% of industrial units, and get this, 70% of all tourist hotels. This isn't just a pretty beach to visit. It's the literal engine of the nation. So, with that much at stake, it's no surprise there's a special law just for this area. It's called the Coast Conservation Act, or CCA for short. This is the main legal tool they use to manage and protect this incredibly valuable region. So, how does it actually work on the ground? Well, the main tool is a pretty strict permit system. What that means is if you want to do any kind of significant development in the coastal zone, whether you're building a hotel or a new harbor, you first have to get a permit and approval from the Coast Conservation Department. It's a super important checkpoint that makes sure development is planned out, not just a free-for-all. And one of the smartest tools they use is something called a coastal setback, or a buffer zone. The easiest way to think about it is like a no-build or restricted build zone right along the coast. It's a protected strip of land. And these zones aren't just drawn randomly on a map, they're based on science, things like how fast the coast is eroding and how vulnerable the habitats are. It's basically a frontline defense against building things in the wrong places.
Okay, so we've talked about laws and permits, but let's look at the most proactive tool in the entire toolkit. This is the one that's designed to stop damage before it can even start. And that tool is the Environmental Impact Assessment, or EIA. You know the saying, look before you leap? That's exactly what an EIA is. Before any huge project gets the green light, this process forces developers to predict all the potential impacts on the land, the animals, the people. And here's the crucial part. It's not enough to just point out the problems. The EIA has to propose real solutions to lessen the negative impacts, and ideally, even boost the positive ones.
The whole process basically breaks down into 3 key steps. First is scoping, which is where everyone gets together to figure out what the big issues might be. Second, you have the official review and approval of the report. And third, and this part is so important but often forgotten, is monitoring. That's following up to make sure the project is actually doing what it promised to do in the first place. Now, to be clear, not every little construction project needs an EIA. This is for the big stuff, what the law calls prescribed projects. We're talking about massive developments, large-scale mining, new power plants, major transport systems, reclaiming wetlands. It's a level of scrutiny saved for the projects that could really change the environment in a big way. So when you step back and look at it all, the framework is there. You've got the Constitution setting the mission, the courts setting the precedents, and powerful tools like the CCA and the EIA. These laws aren't just ink on a page. They're meant to be a living shield. And that leaves us with the final, most important question. It's not about whether the laws are good enough, it's about how they're used. How can the citizens and the state work together to make sure that shield is always up, always ready, actively defending the very natural treasures that make Sri Lanka, well, Sri Lanka?